Welcome to the Inside Pitch. I'm Christopher Lockhart, the creator and administrator of this Facebook group where screenwriters, filmmakers, and creatives meet to ask and answer questions and exchange ideas and information on the craft and business of movie making. I am joined, as always, by my very dear friend, Ramesh Santanam.
Hi, everyone.
Ramesh is, of course, a co-administrator of our group, and our third administrator, Steve Enlow. We always like to say hello to him because he puts in a lot of hard work, but doesn't like to share his face on screen. So Ramesh, we have a really intriguing interview today. This is I don't think this is somebody that we come across very often.
No, we don't.
In fact, I've been doing some reading. So I'm
ready.
I am all ready. And so why don't you do the introduction?
Okay. Hi. Today's guest is Paul Puri, who is a TV writer, psychiatrist, and entrepreneur. He is currently working on the hit NBC show Chicago Med as an executive story editor. He began on the show as a medical consultant. Earlier this year, NBC announced it was renewing Chicago Med for another 3 seasons. In addition to working on the show full-time, Paul continues to have a small private medical practice where he practices multiple forms of psychotherapy, including hypnosis, in addition to medication management. He also is a clinical assistant professor at UCLA, the president of the Psychiatric Clinical Faculty Association at UCLA, and the chief medical officer for an online mental health tech startup called Utify. Paul, welcome to the Inside Pitch.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'll try to be as interesting as you're setting me up to be.
Well, I feel like the dumbest man on the face of the earth after that introduction. So this to me is fascinating that you are a psychiatrist who is working in television. And of course, here at the Inside Pitch, we embrace psychiatry and we love our psychotropic meds, and so you are a hero to us. And so why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background prior to getting into television?
Sure. I've sort of always had kind of dual identities in various forms. I'm half Indian, I'm half white. I grew up in the Midwest where you sort of bounce between these, and I was started writing at a pretty young age, short stories when I was a little kid, and then bad plays in college, and onwards into screenplays starting at 17. I wrote my first screenplay and then just sort of put it in and out of the drawer throughout, and decided that even though I was directing plays during college, that I wanted to go to medical school. And as soon as I got accepted, I said, this TV thing seems really interesting. I think I want to explore pursuing that on the side. And so I got into medical school, and I had a conversation with a writer-producer who basically a mentor, my playwriting professor from college connected me to, who was a writer-producer on CSI. And she said, and this is now going back a number of years, probably 15 years now. And she was like, oh yeah, you just write a spec script. And so I was in medical school and I'm writing spec scripts for like House and other medical shows, and then started making, video shorts and went through medical school and just kept going and said, oh, I think I'm gonna, I don't know that the TV thing is going to go anywhere for me. I don't know if I have it, and I don't know if I can develop it. I have a real interest in this and would love to develop it, but I also have now this medical career, and sort of once you start accruing, 50 grand a year in debt, you kind of have to see where that goes. And so I said, okay, let me figure out how I can develop a career here that I would love and be able to stay in if I need to, but also which can serve my writing. And how can I use it in the writing? And so sort of developing the writing in any spare minutes that I could. I wrote probably like 5 spec scripts throughout med school and residency. And then eventually, made my way into psychiatry because I found that fascinating and I thought I could be pretty good at it. And then basically along the way, I realized that there's a lot of interesting things in understanding people that informs how to understand characters and story. And obviously those two work well together. So it just became a process on these two things that can dovetail and play well in parallel also. And trying to nurture each of them without burning out, basically.
Most people have fallback careers out in Hollywood, like they wait tables or they drive Uber, and you're a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'm impressed that through medical school you wrote, and it sounds like you wrote a lot.
Yeah, I think by the time I got to LA, I'd written probably 9 scripts between like spec pilots and spec episodes. So it was, anytime it's just, make a large body of work and try and level up. It's like you look back now at the beginning and it's like, oh, I thought I was okay after my first couple scripts, and then I look back on that stuff, it's not even readable at this point. So I knew it was going to take a lot of time to get to a place where it was any good.
But there's a real lesson here for writers, which is that there's no excuse not to write. I mean, if you're in medical school and you're cranking out 9 scripts, people should be able to find the time, regardless of what they're doing, to write. It's so crucial. If you're a writer, you write. You don't rest on that one script that you wrote 4 years ago. You need to continue to write, and I'm really impressed. So can we just ask about your interest in psychiatry? What was it that you found so intriguing?
You go to medical school and you do a couple years of like a lot of classwork, and then you get into, and along the way there's these different options that you have. You can go and do surgery, you can do what's called internal medicine, which becomes all these specialties like cardiology or other things you can specialize in. And then there's psychiatry and neurology, and along the way you do rotations to try to figure out what you might like. And I was a psychology and theater undergraduate majors, and it was on a short list already. And then when I got onto the wards and was basically doing some of the work, I got good feedback from my supervisors, but I said, I looked at other stuff, like I thought internal medicine and infectious disease, things like that were interesting, but I said I could be fine at those things, but I thought I could be really good at this if I put my time into it and really focus and try to do better than just the standards of which we're taught. And so I was on a child rotation, and there was, kids there, teenagers who were cutting themselves and hurting themselves. And I really formed some close one-to-one connections working with them just as a student. And it felt like I made a difference. And I thought that, okay, I could see myself doing this potentially. So it became, something where I looked forward to it, getting up in the morning, and I was happy about what I did when I went home at the end of the day. And I said, I think this is it. And so I went down the road of applying and going into psychiatry, which has its own problems. I don't identify with the field, which has become very biological only. In terms of psychopharm, you mentioned, Chris, it's like, I know that medications help, but they're not the whole picture, and I could sort of see the limitations of that. So it also became, how am I going to train beyond what I'm being handed, and get other stuff, because there's deeper issues here about the human condition and helping people to find meaning and purpose in their life that has to go beyond just sort of what a lot of the industry has become, which is symptom checklists. It's like you're 7 out of 10 anxious, and I'm going to give you these pills, and now you're 4 out of 10 anxious, and we're going to call that done. And I think that there's more to it than that. And I don't know, it didn't scratch all the itches that I had.
Given that you have a theater background, I'm going to ask a theater geek question. One of my favorite shows in the last decade is Next to Normal. And I'm wondering if you ever got to see that. And
I did. I actually saw it twice. I saw it once on Broadway, and then I took it was touring, and I took my residency class to go see it.
wow.
It was because I thought it was a beautiful. For those that don't know it, it's this. It was a Pulitzer Prize winning musical, and it was this beautiful story about this family dealing with grief and what we call complicated grief, but also the mother who was diagnosed with bipolar and her sort of cycling through various medications for it. What I loved the most about it, though, was this this version of the siblings, the children of the mother. And there's a song called Superman and the Invisible Girl. And it's the way it beautifully constructed how family dynamics can play out, because there is this absent son who died and he's gone. He's invisible, right? But the mother has turned him into the perfect version of whatever he was or whatever he could have been. And then there's this girl here who's alive, the sister or the daughter, and she is invisible to the mom. The mom doesn't see her because she's still grieving the son that died. And she is working so hard to be perfect and super in order to be seen. And there's this just beautiful complementarity to it that it just really struck me.
Wow. I like the way you said it. I just would have said, yeah, it was really good. It's actually an incredibly moving piece, and you did mention that it won the Pulitzer. Such a perhaps odd subject matter to musicalize, and they did it beautifully. So, but it's interesting to hear you the way you take the psychology of it and then dramatize it, which is interesting to me since I'm a dramaturg. And so let's talk about your transition. So I know that you were writing, but then somehow you slid from going to medicine into writing. And so what did that transition look like? How did it happen?
You mean professionally writing, like being paid for it, or do you mean just the writing? Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it was a lot of stutter starts, kind of, typical Hollywood stories. So I came here to LA in 2011, and, I was writing and working, and, I had these little successes that I thought, oh, this is it. I won Scriptapalooza. And that was, I thought, now I've got it. This is gonna be my break. And then I didn't even get a single call from a rep, or email or anything. And then I got I put a pilot on the blacklist, when they first started being able to post TV pilots, and it got optioned by a production company. Within a week and a half, I was like, whoa, this is it. This is so great. Then the TV wing of that production company folded a week after that. So it was like, okay, now it's dead. It's like all these common stories. So for me, it was getting connected to something called Hollywood Health and Society, which is a nonprofit at USC, which is basically their responsibility is to try to help the medical technical accuracy of film and television. So they basically have a database of doctors who are experts and that will answer questions in terms of sort of one-offs for no credit and no money, just sort of to help, get the public health information out there in a more accurate way. So I got on that, and I just started getting pulled into writers' rooms because there weren't many people who were talking about mental health. So I did an Amazon show, and it was just like one-off things. I'd go and I'd talk to the room for an hour or two, and then they'd be like, "That's so great!" And so that's how Chicago Med and actually Instinct came up also. But they were like, for Chicago Med, it was the show was just starting. They hadn't produced anything yet, and they said basically, we have a psychiatry character. Can you come in and talk about psychiatry? So I did, and it became something where they're like, actually, this is really great. Would you want to do this regularly? And there was a lot of internal drama because they changed showrunners and other stuff happened. So the whole first season, I sort of helped out on the side unofficially. And then the second season, they said, we want you to keep doing this. I said, well, you got to at least give me credit or something. Like, I can't just do this for free forever. I have goals with it. And so finally, the writers introduced me to the new showrunners, because there'd been a turnover of medical advisors too, and they said, we really like you. Let's bring you on, to help out the whole season. And then once I was working with them on their stories and everything, I said, by the way, I'm a writer. Here's some samples. And they said, oh, okay, well, we'll give you a freelance story this season. And it wasn't even a freelance, it was a third of a freelance story. Like, you're going to do the episode with 2 other more seasoned writers and see whether you can cut it. And that went well. And then the next season they said, okay, we'll give you a freelance episode. And most of our episodes are co-written, aside from the showrunners and the co-EPs. We'll solo write every so often. So now we're in season 3. I split that. That went well. And then season 4, they said, okay, we'll staff you. And so I said, okay, now I'm at this big inflection point where I say, I had like a fully pretty thriving private practice at that point that was full, that I built up so that I could have the independence and the income to be able to write. And now I'm writing. So I dialed that down to basically 1 day a week, and took the job, and I've been on it I'm in my 3rd season, staffed on the show. So here we are.
Do you ever feel a yearning to be doing psychiatry full time?
No, not really. I think I enjoy psychiatry work. I enjoy like helping individuals, but there is my problem and my curse is basically that I have a lot of itches that have to be scratched, and nothing quite does it completely. And so even as like the success with writing has amped up a little bit, I've not stepped away. I've not taken my foot completely out of the clinical pool. I still see patients for like 8 to 10 hours on Saturdays, in addition to like the full-time stuff on the TV show. So I haven't quite let that go yet. And I think that, I don't know, people have psychiatry careers until they're 80. So I could always go back to it if, TV doesn't always last that long.
That's why I thought you were 80. So, for our viewers, I don't know what I was expecting, but when you hear a psychiatrist, I was just expecting, maybe some older man with a gray beard smoking a pipe, and then we get this guy. So certainly shattering the stereotypes of psychiatry, that's for sure. And Mr. Ramesh,
when you started off as a consultant for like Instinct and then Chicago Med, can you give a little detail, like how involved were you? Were you involved with the plotting of shows? Did they only come to you when they had issues about, does this look right? Does this look or sound right? Or were you sort of involved in how the stories came about?
Yeah, I mean, it was mostly involved with the writers' rooms for both shows.
Okay.
They're both the writers' room for Instinct was in New York, and they shot it in New York. The writers' room for Med is here in LA, and it's shot in Chicago. So initially, I was pulled in to talk with the room for Chicago Med, and then to basically help the writers break stories. So they'd say, we want to do something about this. And I'd say like, okay, well, here's some stuff that exists in the clinical world. There's like, I would just spitball ideas, and I would deliver it in a way that was trying to be digestible for writers and for stories, because I knew that would make it easier, as opposed to just talking about concepts or trying to talk about like what exists in the real world that is not necessarily dramatic or dramatizable or presentable on TV. So like some things that I thought might be interesting or ways to break the story. And so we'd sort of spitball back and forth, and sometimes I'd pass them articles or other stuff, and then they'd go research and come back. Instinct actually came up after I was working on Med for, I think, a season or two. And they basically called me and said, would you speak to our room? We want to talk about forensic psychiatry and forensic psychology. And so I talked with them about it, and they said, would you want to do this full time? I said, yeah, but I have to clear it with Med. And Med was okay because it was a completely different kind of genre. Instinct was like a basically a detective show in New York City that was trying to use psychology as part of the process. And that was a harder show to work with because I didn't have as much time with the writers. It was a first season show, so they're really trying to figure out what the tone is and trying to meet the many masters. It was also based on like a James Patterson novel that was trying to have tie-in. So it was all the competing interests that happen in a first season show and trying to figure it all out. So there wasn't a lot of room for me to help as much as I would have liked to. They won a couple seasons though.
Do you find it frustrating sometimes if the writers are concocting stuff about psychiatry or medicine that is just complete bullshit?
I try not to take it personally, if that's what you mean. I think that, we all have, there's sort of the myths involved, and there's the ways that these things are presented by the media historically. One of the things I'm pretty proud of about Med is the way we've tried to present a positive sort of mental health professional, rather than being the crazy person or the person who's relatively unstable. We have Oliver Platt, and he's like the grandfather or like the wise man on the show that a lot of people turn to. Not that that's the only way that the figure, he's still human and he has things, he's been married 3 times and he's got his own issues, but that, we aren't feeding the stigma in terms of the show. So, thankfully the showrunners have been very conscientious about not misrepresenting the field, and Oliver Platt has as well. His main thing is that he didn't want to misrepresent the field or professionals in a way that would essentially hurt the field or hurt people who need help. So I think we've been able to have good conversations along the way, and everyone's open to feedback about what does and doesn't exist.
Do you find that when you're creating characters that you're leaning very heavily on the world of psychology?
I would say moderately. I think that it has to inform everything, and I think that when we're making choices, when we're making choices, we can sort of map out. I really draw from that in terms of, does this make emotional sense for a person based on what we've constructed? And sometimes we'll be spitballing things because it seems interesting or juicy or salacious in terms of where a character could go or a story could go. And, we do have to point out, okay, that just doesn't track with what we've set up. There may be a way to get there, but we are going to need to introduce this element of a backstory or someone else to push them in this direction for that to make sort of emotional and psychological sense.
But I like that you're using the word emotional.
Oh, yeah.
So we know that the characters that you're creating are not clinical. They have a real emotionality to them.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that writers in general have a fascination with psychiatry and with therapy and with people's psyches. I mean, I think that the writing process itself is partially an introspective process, and trying to externalize it in some way onto a page. But that I think that it's very easy to try to fall into every character doing therapy as the way of delivering exposition or delivering their inner monologue. And I think that we really challenge ourselves to try to be able to tell that internal story externally through whatever case they're dealing with this week. So it's always a challenge, but it's one we enjoy.
Mr. Ramesh?
I take it you're repped, right? You have a agent, manager.
I have a manager. I actually don't have an agent right now. I haven't joined anybody since the whole guild fiasco. Okay. So I actually got my job without a rep. And
that was my question. How did you go about getting repped?
Yeah, so the first rep I got was somebody off of it was one of these pitching sites, because I was really outside of the entire system. I said, okay, I'll do anything to try and get something because I need some way to get access. So I did like a cold pitch, and someone said, oh, we'll rep you, and that didn't go very well. The relationship didn't work out, so I let them go. And then one of the writers on Med basically recommended me to his manager, who we had a conversation. He hired me the day I got the offer from Med to be staffed. So yeah, And we've had conversations about going out to agents since, but we haven't gone through that process yet, because this is the year basically, because my contract's going to be up for renegotiation. So it's time to get a rep.
So did you separate from your agent as a result of the WGA ATA conflict?
I did not have to, because I didn't have one yet. So
okay.
I separated from my manager because he had given me notes on a pilot that I think it made the pilot worse, basically. And I followed the notes because I thought, okay, this is what I need in order for him to submit it. Afterwards, in retrospect, I was sort of like, okay, this actually made it worse. And I got notes back from some people that basically were like, there's these things missing. And I'm like, oh, those are the exact things that he told me to take out. So I was like, I don't think this is going to work.
So what would be your advice for new writers who are looking for managers? What have you learned in working with managers that perhaps they could apply?
Yeah, I mean, it's what I would say is that, managers are from my experience, managers are looking for relatively, like, not low-hanging fruit, but things that they can really see the potential for it. So I think that when you're a bit of an outsider, whether you're in LA or not, what you're looking for is for someone to be willing to take a chance on you. And the more you can sort of set things up to say, like, there's a higher probability that I'm going to succeed, and you can sort of show them the map on how that happens, the easier it becomes. For me, it was pretty easy because I already had a job, basically, that they could make money off of. But for others, it becomes, it's like, okay, can I, and this is something that he said, like, even because I hadn't quite gotten that job yet, he said, look, I think you're going to get this job, but even if you don't, I can really see how I can sell you, how I can staff you to try to get you staffed. And so, I had sort of pre-formulated my story in a way that was trying to be presentable as a writer on how I would be useful in writers' rooms. Which, maybe it seems really obvious, but I have friends who are other doctors in TV, and they don't necessarily see they think like, oh, well, you can talk about medicine, but you can't really, because you're just a psychiatrist. And I'm like, okay, that negates all the understanding about people and humans and characters and emotional journeys, but that's fine. I didn't have to sell them. I just had to sell my manager and help him sell me. So helping to understand what your story is, and understand how you can package that in a way that other people can package it and make it unique in a way, and understanding where you sort of fit into the niche. Like, I don't necessarily want to write medical dramas all my life, but I knew that was probably going to be my way in. And so, a lot of my samples were sort of set up for that. So it's trying to align as many things as possible to sort of clear the road for where you think you should go.
We talk a lot about branding ourselves, and so in a sense that's
Absolutely.
what you did, but more distinctly you said that you had a story, and I love that, the idea that you're creating a story, and as storytellers it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I had reached out with and worked a little bit with Carol Kirshner. Carol's she's a former exec with Amblin TV. She's the head of the Writers Guild, the WGA Showrunners Training Program, and was big in the CBS Diversity Showcase, diversity program for writers. And so she has a separate little program that she does. She'll work with people. And her whole thing is like, what's the log line of your life? And so I was like, okay, let me, I've written essays about myself and my journey, but I've done that for different audiences. So the question was sort of, how do you formulate your biography in a way that makes it a clear story that's interesting and highlights your features and highlights, your features in a way for writing so that it's really already kind of easily digestible and understood. And so I appreciated that sort of take on it as something to bring when I started approaching reps.
Yeah, I think writers are constantly considering how to pitch their screenplays, but they're not considering how to pitch themselves. And that, I guess in the beginning, is probably the most important pitch.
Yeah, and that comes back to sort of the idea that there are different skill sets. Like when you're when you're not staffed yet, you know, there's sort of the skill sets I think about in TV is like there's your skills on the page, there's your room skills, your ability to function well within a writer's room. And that means being able to come up with a lot of ideas, not step on toes, navigate the dynamics and politics of a room, and helping to enhance the showrunner's voice. That's all like its own skill set. And then there's like the producer skills, which is, you know, being able to produce your episodes, you know, once you get to set and are there, because writing in TV is a writer-producer ladder. And not everybody knew that. I didn't know that at first either. And so those are like different skill sets. And when you're just starting out, all you can really do is do the stuff on the page. But if you can craft your narrative to speak to other aspects, that, you know, is just going to increase your chances, I think.
Ramesh?
Your writing process. What's it like? Do you outline? Do you do beat sheets? Do you do index cards?
You mean for the show?
For the show, and also, do you write specs? I know you're really busy with everything you're doing. I don't know where you find the time for anything. But do you sort of write your own sort of original pilots or features, or anything, and then sort of the process for both?
Yeah, I mean, I've done, my general process is at first I'll just sort of spitball in kind of a flow of consciousness sort of writing. I usually use one of two programs. I use something called Write or Die, which is like, it's just free text, but it's like, you can put a time pressure or a word count on it. And if you don't keep typing, it'll start turning the screen red, or it'll like bring this like really alarming sound on.
That's great.
So I'll do that. There's also a counter version, which will reward you with pictures of kittens or puppies when you hit a word count, stuff like that. We're all kind of in a big Skinner box. So I'll do that. And sometimes I'll write 25 pages of just like rambling thoughts about where an idea could go before I start to come to some kind of shape with it. And then if I'm doing this is all about pilot. If I'm doing the TV show, what we do is we have a board, which is actually on my other computer screen right now. We have a board in terms of an episode breakdown and, you know, going across the top, and then the characters and what's going to happen per episode roughly. And then once we figure out sort of the evolution of a character over a third or a half of a season, or even 3 episodes, then we'll start to try to figure out cases and how those things what can fit into each of those. And then once we break cases, we try to essentially do one case at a time and break the story beat by beat in terms of like, you know, what's going to happen in linear order, what's the setup, you know, what's the character's point of view, what are the obstacles they're facing, what's the turn for it, where do they end up, what's the resolution, all that kind of stuff, and try to break all of that. And then eventually we put it on a board, and then we mix it, and we do what's called we board it and we mix those in terms of in the acts. And so we figure out it's like in the mix cards, except we usually use colored sheets of paper, and figure out, you know, what is the order of the A story, B story, C story, D story, and what's going to fall into what act, so that's relatively evenly distributed. And that'll, you know, that involves conversations where we do it, you know, if we're doing it 2 of us writing an episode, we'll have a conversation and play with it for a while. Then we present it to the room and they give feedback. And sometimes, you know, we can cut out some beats or combine them or reorder. And then we basically have a board, and then we pull that back into creating an outline. And then we pass the outline around. The Wolf Company gives their notes, and Network and Studio gives notes. We do passes on the outline, and then we usually go from that to script and write the script, and then that has to go through notes processes as well. Am I dumping too much?
No, not at all.
No, I'm just I'm curious as to how do you adapt to that? So because I doubt that when you were writing your spec scripts that you had boards and colored papers and also you perhaps didn't have to work with the kind of alacrity that you must in TV. So how did you adapt to all of this? Because it does sound a little overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I think of anything overwhelming. I deal with this with patients sometimes. It's just about like,
I'm stressed out, Doc.
Yeah, Chris, just take a breath, take a couple of breaths. All right. And then we try to break things down into the smallest pieces possible. So it's like, what is the sequence that you're doing? You're just in this phase right now. And sometimes the unfortunate thing, and you know, this is not unique to my show or any show, is things will get noted, and as you're trying to meet the notes, you may lose sight of what you originally intended. And there, you know, that's a little bit of a dagger in the heart sometimes, but you recognize that this is a collaborative process, and you do the best you can, and you usually end up with like 70% of what you intend getting to screen. And sometimes the notes are really good and they point out stuff that you missed, and you know, you try to get the best version of what you wanted to on screen. But it's, you know, there are ego blows that have to happen. You have to step out of the idea that if you want to be a completely independent person with, like, you have your solo vision, you get to make whatever you want, you can either like reach the point that Noah Hawley's at, or you can, you know, go become an independent, you know, filmmaker, and you still have to figure out how to pay for it. Or you get to work in the other constraints, because all of these things have constraints. If you're working in elite TV, you know, premium cable, for example, you know, you might have constraints on budget, or you might have constraints on what the network or studio wants, or you might have constraints in terms of the number of seasons that you want, because Netflix only limits it to 3 seasons. Or, you know, in network TV, we go for a very broad audience, and so there's sort of rules in terms of how we have to construct and portray characters. And so you have to find ways, and this, a lot of writers will say this, that, you know, people bristle at the idea of too many rules because it stifles your creativity. Well, it actually forces you in many ways to get more creative, because you have to find ways to work within those rules, and you really have to dig deeper to do that, as opposed to the unstructured blank page is the hardest thing to navigate. Blather.
That's for sure. No, but that's for sure. Go ahead, Ramesh.
No, initially you talked about the writer's room. Can you, when you first got to the writer's room, and you have a lot of experience in the writer's room, can you give some advice to new writers, especially about the do's and don'ts when you get into a writer's room?
Yeah, I mean, the basics is like, every room is different. Every writing staff is different. And so you have to recognize a couple of things, one of which is there's going to be a dynamic there. And if there is, like, if I jump to my other skill set, and we look at something called group therapy, there's something called, I think it's Tuckman's groups, stages of groups. And there's basically like forming, norming, and storming. And so, like, if a group has not really come into it, like if you're coming into a room at the very beginning of a show, nobody knows anything yet, aside from who the showrunner is, maybe who the number 2 is, things like that. And so there's going to be sort of a pecking order or something that's going to form. The dynamics haven't really taken shape yet. If you're coming into a pre-existing show, you need to step lightly, because you need to figure out what the dynamics are, because they will have been established, and you are an outsider. And so you have to sort of figure out how to be able to step into it progressively and add to it, as opposed to like trying to draw attention to yourself necessarily. You want to be looking, how can I enhance, you know, what people are trying to do? For me, it's like, you know, people will turn to me for like the technical advice, or like, does something make sense emotionally? And so that gives me like areas to speak, and I can sort of, I've carved out like a predetermined like area to sort of speak about, so that I have a presence within the room. But then, you know, staff writers may feel that they speak too much or too little, and you just have to play around with that a little bit. And, you know, it never hurts to say like, this might be a bad pitch, or this might be a stupid pitch. It always like softens it, as opposed to being like, let me give you my best pitch, and it falls like really flat, and then you feel terrible. So like, just take it easy and ease into the process bit by bit.
We play a game called Worst Idea Ever. Yeah. So, you know, anytime we're sort of pitching stuff, we'll say, all right, this is the worst idea ever. Even if maybe you don't think it's the worst idea ever, you'll still sort of say that. And by the way, it might be the worst idea ever, but I have seen great ideas evolve because of the worst idea ever.
Because those worst ideas are often outside of the box that you're stuck in. And so like, once you start getting outside the box, then people are like, no, that doesn't work. But the fact that you just had him finding out his brother's not his brother gives me this other idea about family, and I can see where that goes, and boom, 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 boom. Like it really is a very nice organic process. The difficulty, I've heard about this in other rooms that I've not been a part of, is when people don't have the room to sort of speak up. There are stories of punitive showrunners that sort of like scold someone when they pitch a bad idea, and that's really, I've heard, stifling to the process. Yeah.
Diversity and inclusion, of course, are big issues right now in town. And can you speak to that at all based on perhaps your own experiences or what you're seeing in the rooms around you or your fellow writers?
Yeah, I mean, it's on our show, you know, there's been issues in terms of not issues on the show. There's been issues that we're talking about in the public, like Black Lives Matter, and how can we actually address that within the context of a medical show. And so that's something we're still developing, but we're in conversations with people who are very involved in terms of like equity, inclusion, and justice issues really within the medical system, because there's all kinds of issues, everything from marketing of drugs to issues related to racial disparities in terms of medical outcomes based on probably implicit biases within doctors. And so we're exploring how to do that within the context of or in construct of what our show is. In terms of inclusion of writers, we have a moderately diverse staff. We could have an argument about whether women should be counted as diverse when the bar that you're comparing it to is white men. They could be, but we have me, who's half Indian. There's an African American male writer. There's a African American / Persian female writer. It's in the conversations in terms of people's representation. But I wouldn't say that we haven't hired anybody really new, so it's not actually changed anything in terms of who we're staffing right now. But it does come in terms of our representations on the show. We have a majority minority cast. We have 3 African American women. We have a Persian American male surgeon. We have, trying to even think about everybody. We have a Korean. Brian is a half Korean, half Japanese male. So it's actually like it's implicit kind of in how we're presenting things. What we're having conversations about is how to address that also in the stories and not just in the race of the actors. Does that kind of get to it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
How is your writer's room functioning now with COVID? And then also the other COVID question is, you work on a medical show. Invariably, I'm guessing at some point COVID's going to have to play a role in the stories.
Yeah, I mean, we took several months off. We had to cut our last season short because of COVID, and we are incorporating it into the show. I can't give any details about that. But yeah, it's going to be part of the story and part of the conversation. There are other difficulties in terms of, trying to. Production happens way earlier than air dates, and so being able to figure out, and we have to write months ahead of that before production, and so being able to think ahead in terms of where is COVID going to be by the time this shoots, and our best guesses with that is all, and by the time this airs, is something that we're trying to plan for. In terms of our writer's room, we took a couple months off, and now we're doing basically a Zoom room most days of the week as we're trying to like break other parts of the season. But generally what we do is we come into the room when we're breaking part of a season, and then we sort of break apart to write our individual episodes. And then we'll come back together when we're trying to spitball something, which might involve like, okay, the showrunners are starting to move into the next block of episodes because they're writing that next one, and they want us to help us figure out where this is going to go. So they're platforming everything properly.
And so you said, and occasionally you have like 2 writers may tackle an episode. So when you're doing it now with Zoom, where you're not in the room together,
Yeah.
Is it like you go off and write one part and the other person writes the other part? Or are you writing sort of for a Google Doc sort of thing where you can both
Yeah.
see the changes happening live?
It varies per episode and per team. But what we've done is we will talk out sort of where stories could go. I actually live across the street from the person I wrote the last episode from, so that was very convenient. So we met at an acceptable distance with masks as we like talked out some of the episodes, but then we basically split the storylines. So one of us will do a first pass on two of them, on like A and C, and the other one will do B and D, and then we exchange notes on them, and then we do a weave, which is all in a document that we're sharing, like a final draft document, and then we exchange it back and forth and do notes before we send it to basically like the showrunners for their notes. So it's, technology manages a lot of it. It's just there's always something different when you're sitting in the room with someone and you're just sort of like wandering. We could do, and there's a different sort of dynamic with that as opposed to when your family is like mumbling in your ear. And I love my family, but
all right, so I sort of have a kind of an odd question maybe, but and I don't mean to offend here, but
go ahead, offend me.
do you feel, as writers, like this business, we love this business, it's important to us, we love to entertain, but come on, TV writing versus your work in psychiatry, I mean, do you ever feel like, like I sold out, or, I mean, my work in psychiatry, that will have a profound impact on the world. And how do you reconcile that? Is there any kind of reconciling with that?
There's no one answer I would say to that, Chris. It's a great question, and it's something that I play with, and maybe that's why I've never taken my foot out of any of these ponds. But I think, before I went to medical school, I was working with some labs up in UC San Francisco. And basically I was talking with one of my bosses who was a brain researcher. And he's like, you don't really want to go to medical school. It's like, you go become a doctor, you can help like one person at a time. It's like you become a PhD researcher, you could help thousands or millions of people with your breakthrough. Or you might help none because your research doesn't go anywhere, but you could help millions. And I thought about that, and it really, these are different sort of services. So the one-to-one work that I do with someone clinically is really rewarding in terms of how I change an individual life. The nature of storytelling, I think, is important. It's important to me personally because I enjoy the process of storytelling and the impact that stories have had on my life. But the more we go along, you go through the science world, you also recognize that science and facts doesn't actually penetrate the human psyche in many ways. It's stories that do. This is the reason that people listen to anecdotal evidence as opposed to like statistics. It's because anecdotes are a form of story and they penetrate the mind, they get through to people. And, there's actual research that people get a majority of their medical information from medical TV shows. So being able to do that in a conscientious way and actually connect to people, we have an audience. I think when you count streaming and international everything, we have an audience of something like 60 million viewers over a season. So it's like, we're reaching 60 million people. That's huge. Like, what psychiatrist has that kind of reach? So, and then there's all the other things in terms of if my career moves forward, presuming it does, is there freedoms and ability to tell other stories that I think might have an even better or different impact on the world that I think is important. And maybe, so I think all of those are there. And then the third thing is I have this mental health tech startup, which I think that if we do it right and it takes off, could have enough of a bigger impact on sort of the public health system. So I guess it's trying to leverage things in different ways or hedge a little bit of saying like, look, I like doing these things. I want to do them in a way that doesn't hurt the world and hopefully helps it. But also I'm not going to live completely altruistically only and say like, I could give you the same argument of saying like, I'm a psychiatrist that is in private practice. Why am I not? I used to work with the homeless out in Venice and Santa Monica. I used to do something called street medicine work. Like that was interesting, and I got paid a little bit for it, but I could have made more money doing something else. You know, why don't I just give all of my time? It's the question of like, how do you find the right balance between what is rewarding and beneficial to society and also what is rewarding for me personally? And that might be a moving target. That's another blathering answer.
No, it's a very thoughtful answer. And I would love to see a TV show about a psychiatrist working with homeless people. Clearly, there's so many psychiatric issues out on the streets. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a that probably has to get into more of sort of sociological storytelling rather than just purely psychological storytelling, because of the institutional barriers that end up creating and feeding homelessness, expensive housing and job markets and educational systems and all of that, and drug issues. But yeah, that's I look forward to the day that I might be able to tell those stories. We've done a little of it on Med, but you know, maybe we could go deeper with a different show.
You mentioned earlier that you would like to break out and tell other kinds of stories. So what sort of genres would you work in if you weren't telling a story set in medicine?
You know, I have a soft spot for genre stuff, sci-fi, fantasy, horror. I've honestly written no real samples that are showable in that area yet. But I think that those are interesting to me as different ways of sort of doing, whether it's social commentary or in terms of telling individual stories that is not quite on the nose in the same way. I think, you know, Lovecraft Country just did it in an interesting way, and Watchmen as well, in terms of telling stories about the racial disparities through sort of genre lenses. So yeah, that's probably in there. But I think anything, you know, I've got a broad love of TV and film, everything from detective stories to drama to, I don't think I'm funny enough to write comedy, but maybe teamed with somebody, I could come up with some stuff.
Have you written any features?
My first script was a feature. I've only written like 2 features. Yeah, not a lot.
Is that something that you would like to do also?
I had a feature idea that came to, it was a comedy action adventure with a fantasy twist to it that came to me in a dream. And it's one of those ones where I was literally breaking out laughing, and which woke me up from the dream because it was just such a silly concept. But I'm like, there's,
by the way, we know how much psychiatrists like dreams.
Yes, I love dreams. But it was one of those ones where I'm like, this could be a feature. I can't see a TV show out of it, but I can make it a feature. So I broke an outline for a feature, but I haven't written it yet.
I used to keep a pad next to my bed, and I would write down my dreams, not necessarily as fodder for a story, but just, you know, because you're like, wow, I got to write that dream down.
I did that once actually, because, and I remember waking up in the middle of the night thinking, this is a brilliant idea. And I jotted it down, fell back to sleep. I woke up in the morning and I had written, a man is denied an apartment for having a thought.
Wow.
I have no idea what it means.
Yeah, you know, I've done the same thing where you're like, my God, this is a blockbuster, and then you go back to sleep, and then you wake up the next morning, you read it, and it's fucking Die Hard.
Yeah.
Great.
So, can you talk a little bit about your interaction, your relationship with your manager? Do you pitch him original ideas, and do you sort of spitball and brainstorm? No, you should do this, not this right now.
Yeah, I mean, I will spitball, like I'll bring him anything that I think is interesting in terms of, I'll see an article about something, or I'll see a book that's potentially could be optioned. And so we have sort of loose discussions about it. Development has been kind of limited because of my contract. Early TV writers in certain studios, basically you're not allowed to develop till you hit a certain level in the writer-producer hierarchy. So I'm not there yet. So it's sort of like, let's have preliminary discussions. What could we do with this? where would it be sellable, and then sort of put it on the roadmap for down the road when, you know, when I have time and the actual legal freedom to be able to develop that. But it's generally a conversation throughout. Sorry, I'm just getting texts.
Can you talk a little bit about meetings, taking meetings? What should new writers expect? Do's and don'ts, tips when it comes to taking meetings, either with showrunners or managers or whoever it is.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of, I want to say like you can't be over prepared, but you can be over prepared if like you sound too rote in your, if it sounds like a stump speech. But you want to be prepared enough with the idea that you can talk about yourself, talk about script ideas, give commentary on things, but because there's the very real possibility that the person you're going to meet with really knows nothing about you, that somebody else set up the meeting or someone recommended, and so they're going to want you to sort of pitch yourself or pitch ideas or say like, why are we meeting right now? Because sometimes you're going to walk in and they're going to know nothing about you. So you have to sort of go through the steps of sales, which is like credibility, relevance, you know, stuff like that. You have to speak to those issues and be able to talk about it in a concise way if possible. So those are important things to think about. And then there's, you know, who are you meeting within an organization and what are you aiming for? So if you're just trying to build, generally, I think it's good to try to build relationships. This is not a new idea, but you know, you need multiple points of contact. The entire idea, I think, of an elevator pitch is kind of silly. It's like, I know one person who almost sold a script off of an elevator pitch to J.J. Abrams. And it was like somebody introduced like, oh, this guy's got a script that kind of fits in your wheelhouse. He's like, oh yeah, what is it? And he like had to deliver it. And the guy's like, oh, you should send that over to me. And then via some hullabaloo, it didn't happen. But, you know, I think for the majority of it, people invest in relationships. So finding ways to create and deepen relationships ends up creating the idea then of, oh, how can we collaborate or how can we work together? Because you're not, I say this with full tongue in cheek about my profession, you're not a crazy person. You're not a crazy person. So you're someone I'd like to develop a working relationship now with. So how can I go further with that? So that should be part of sort of your goals in, I think, having a meeting, is trying to create an ongoing relationship so you can meet with someone further. And you're not gonna hit all of them. You know, I have a patient who is an A-list actor, and she said, you know, when she first came into it, she had heard from another A-list actor about like, you need to expect to fail a lot. And so she had gotten the word like, okay, look at how many auditions does it take to actually hit a role? And it was something like 60 was the average, 60 auditions to get a role. And she said, I'm not going to consider myself a failure until I've done 60 auditions and gotten rejected from all 60. And she didn't go through 60 to get that, but by setting that number, you don't have the expectation that you're going to hit every one of them, or everyone is going to be completely fascinated by you. And you take the pressure off of yourself, because it's the pressure that can really cook you sometimes.
Ramesh, do you have a final question for the good doctor?
Actually, one is, when you said you came out to LA in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
How did you network? Did you do it? And like, how did you network when you
Pretty
realized
badly.
you wanted to get it?
I mean, I basically, I would grab onto and explore any community I could find. And 2011, the online communities were not even nowhere near as developed as they are now or as formed. And really people who you could go to for credible sources weren't really great. And so, you know, a lot of times what you end up having is you have access to people who are kind of at your level. And so there's people who are struggling, they're working to sort of move up, and some of those people will actually move up, and you don't know who they are, but you want to have relationships with them and learn from each other and serve each other. And so I went to drinks mixers, and I did some online teleseminars with writing teachers, and I took UCLA classes, and You know, I did anything I could in terms of leveling up my writing, but also building a community of other people who were writing. And many of those people are now, you know, staffed writers on TV shows in other areas who are now friends. And you just don't know how that's going to go. So, you know, I would explore anything that people mentioned, as long as there wasn't too much of a buy-in. If they're asking for, you know, ridiculous amounts of money, or I've done this like 6 times. Like I have a friend and teacher who hosts like a monthly drinks night. I went to probably 10 of those before I'm like, I'm not really developing any further relationships here. I'm not really like improving anything. I'm not meeting new people that I'm really interested by or who are interested in me. Everybody just hands out business cards at that level, and it just says writer on it or screenwriter. And I'm sort of like, okay, now what? It sort of ended there. And so I realized that those things weren't really working. So I moved into other domains. So recognize what's working and try and do more of it, and also critically assess it to see whether it's worth it, and don't overinvest in something that isn't. But if it is, you know, do more.
Okay.
Anything else, Ramesh?
Yeah, one other thing.
Ramesh, it just has thousands of questions.
Oh no, I've known Paul for several years now. So,
Austin Film Festival.
Austin Film Festival, which starts tomorrow, actually.
Oh, does it? Wow.
Yeah. I just got an email notice saying it popped up. Can you talk just a little bit about taking notes? How, you know, as a new writer, how should writers handle taking notes in a writer's room, and also possibly from reps? And also, I take it you have a bunch of readers who read your stuff and give you notes, readers you trust. And so how do you sort of deal with all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I do have to jump off soon because I've got to get on with my room. But I think that the first and hardest thing is probably separating yourself from the work and recognizing that this is a work product that's separate from me. Even though I view myself as an artist and I have created this thing, the thing is not me. And so the critique about this is just about this. And if you don't make it personal, it makes it a lot easier to talk about the product or the thing. That's probably the biggest hurdle for most people. And it was for me too. When I would first get notes, it's like you get notes and you're like, oh my God, it didn't like kill. This wasn't like the best thing you've written. What a punch to the gut for me. And I want to give one other, I remember going to, this sounds like a tangent. I remember going to, when I was in San Diego for residency, I went to the only industry event down there, which was Comic-Con. And basically I went to a writer's panel, and they, you know, everyone on the panel was giving the best advice that they'd gotten as a writer. And one guy leans forward and he picks up the mic and he gets really close and he says, "You are not a special snowflake. No one owes you anything." And, you know, I'm like, however old I was at that point, 28. And, you know, I've gone to medical school, I've gone to residency, I've been writing all this stuff. And I was like, damn it. I was like, I thought you know, people should see my value and immediately give me a job. And that was like, you know, it took years more work before people even read my stuff at any level, or that my stuff was really any good, if I'm being honest. So, you know, divorcing yourself from the product and really focusing on the craft. Focus on the craft and making sure that that's like the priority. So when you're getting notes, then really asking yourself, honestly, are you getting the same, are you getting notes from somebody that is credible and is helping to improve your craft? And it's very easy to discount notes and be like, that person doesn't know what the hell they're talking about, or they just didn't see it. And maybe they didn't see it, and maybe that's because you didn't emphasize it properly. So sometimes people will drop lines in like buried in dialogue that's a piece of exposition that's absolutely key, and it's not been punctuated in the script so that the reader pays attention to it. You know, that's an example. So figuring out how to be able to, you know, read the notes. The classic one is get the note behind the note. So if someone's pitching you a solution to your problem, try and get to what the problem is in the first place that they're noticing and address that. You don't have to necessarily take their solution. And if you really don't like them, but you get the same note from 3 people that you don't like, pay attention to that note. That still is important because it means that something's not landing and it's not going to land for your viewer. And so you got to address it, even if it's uncomfortable. It's like, as a different teacher I had used to say, there's no way around the mountain but through the mountain. Like, you got to go through it, even as painful as it is. And there's painful lessons in there, but the aim is that it improves your craft, because ultimately, as a TV writer, especially, you're not marketing a script. You are marketing you. You're trying to be the best product of being able to generate a lot. TV chews through ideas constantly. Like, you need to be able to work on your craft to be able to produce a lot of material at a rapid pace of pretty good quality.
Okay.
So craft is key. And I think we should leave it at that. We want you to get back to your real world. And but Doctor, we so thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you so much, Paul.
So interesting.
It's been my pleasure, and hopefully we'll get to talk again sometime.
Yep, absolutely. So.